Welcome to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast, where non-diet nutrition, weight-inclusive care, and integrative health collide. We're your hosts, Dana Montes and Christina Hoyt, licensed integrative clinical nutritionists and body image coaches.
And we believe you deserve to have a joyful relationship with food in your body, even if you have a chronic health condition or symptoms that just won't quit. On this show, together and with our guests, we're bringing the real talk, no BS vibe with tangible tools to help you pursue health and wellness without obsession or restriction.
Remember our disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. On today's episode, we are diving into social media, AI, and body image with Sarah Egan and Amanda Bolton from Eating Disorders Training Australia. We'll be talking about what the research says on the impact of social media on negative body image, the crazy world of AI on social media, and tools that you can use to set boundaries on social media to protect your mental health and your body image. Amanda and Sarah are both clinical psychologists based in Australia. They both work in private practice and co-own Eating Disorders Training Australia. As part of EDTA, Amanda and Sarah provide training and supervision to other mental health professionals in the field of eating disorders. They work from a non-diet, weight-inclusive approach and work with eating disorders, disordered eating, and body image concerns. And now let's jump right into today's episode. For both of you, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. We're really excited to talk about all things social media because it is omnipresent, and especially in the populations that we all work with, it can be a very detrimental factor, or in some ways can be a very helpful and healing factor as well to connect with others that are going through the same struggles that our clients are. So one of the things that Christina and I always recommend to clients is to examine their social media use and how that might be contributing to or impacting what they're struggling with, whether that be relationship with food, body image, disordered eating, or even just understanding nutrition, because there is so much conflicting information out there, and social media can make that way, way more confusing. So the reason I wanted to reach out to you all in the first place is because I've taken a course from Fiona Sutherland before, the Trauma-Informed Dietetic Care, and I saw she was doing a webinar with you two on social media, and I was like, oh my God, that would be a great podcast topic and great podcast guest, because we've been wanting to talk about social media more in depth recently. And the webinar that you did, 2 parts, was called Safer Socials, and I would love to know what was the motivation behind that, and kind of what have you all been seeing in your own practice that motivated you to want to do a webinar like that?
Absolutely. Well, it is a great question. Well, in our clinical practice, we certainly see a lot of social media playing a role in terms of perpetuating body image, but also perpetuating a lot of wellness culture, diet culture, lots of myths that we find we're always having to address in our work. But particularly when we were thinking about body image, we found it was often one of the factors that was perpetuating that for people, and quite a significant factor. We were working on bits and pieces in session, and perhaps people were working on, changing their relationship with their body outside of session, and yet it was almost like a bit of a tide pulling them back again. The indoctrination into that thin ideal, athletic ideal, and all those messages that you will see in a social media setting. And so that very much led us to think more around, well, what do we need to do in this space to be able to help people to be able to improve their body image particularly, but also improve their relationship with food too, whilst also using social media. And part of the reason for that is because there's just not a lot out there in this space. And there's not a lot out there. And at the same time, it's so sorely needed.
I was just going to add, we that was the motivation and inspiration really to start to look and delve more deeper into that connection between social media and body image, and think about what we might be able to do in that space. And Sarah and I presented at the Australia New Zealand Eating Disorder Conference here in Australia last year on this topic. And Fiona was our lovely chairperson for that workshop. And that really kind of sparked that conversation and idea around let's get together and maybe talk a little bit more about how do we use social media in a safer way, but also think about some of the harms that come from potentially some of the content that you might come across online, and what do we do about that? So that's kind of the combination of how all of that came together.
Yeah, and those two things that you mentioned are two of the main things that I wanted to dive into today. But I thought it was really interesting because I know you all also wrote a newsletter that was called "It's Not Enough to Just Stop," like to say stop using socials, because especially when you work with people who are teenagers who have grown up with social media, or I mean, I don't even know the age at which people have completely just grown up with social media. And it's like, what do you mean? All of my friends are on there. I can't just stop using this. But also bringing up diet and wellness culture, it is interesting that the instinct is, oh, just cut it out completely, because that's the same advice that people will receive around food and other, quote, toxins and other stuff like that. So when you're talking about it's not enough to say just stop using socials, because it's really not an option for most people, at least for the long term, can you go into what you would suggest otherwise?
Absolutely. I think this is something that we've kind of heard as a general recommendation. That was part of also what kind of prompted our motivation to delve into this topic, because we were hearing that from lots of different spaces, and particularly in our we do a lot of supervision with other health professionals, and this was kind of coming up as a bit of a topic. And usually that's the recommendation people either hear or recommend to others, is just take a break, stop using, delete your apps, all of those kind of things. And sure, if people can and want to do that, then absolutely there's benefit to being able to do that. But as you said, Dana, there's, the younger generation in particular who have grown up with social media, but people in general too may have a lot of connection that comes from that space. That might be where most of their social interaction is coming from, or they might be part of a community. And it's not simple or easy to just stop, because it might actually take away a huge support system for somebody if they disconnect altogether. So in terms of how we think about this, so some of the recommendations are around in the literature around reducing use. So rather than stopping, there's some research to show that it can be helpful to reduce even by 50%. That usually leads to some improvements in terms of body image and general kind of mood and well-being. So that's one thing to consider where that's possible. Sarah and I developed an acronym called PROTECT, that goes through some of the steps when we think about, what are some of the different elements of improving this social media space and the impact it has on body image. So what are some of the steps that we might consider instead of stopping altogether? What do we really need to be looking at? And I'll go through the acronym. So P is for pause. So we talk about this idea of becoming a bit more aware of noticing your own mood and vulnerabilities and needs before you dive into social media or you go online, so that there's that kind of awareness there to start with. R is for reality check. So we talk a lot about social media literacy. So this is all about understanding what might be the motivation behind what is being posted when you come across different content. Who is sharing this? Are they a person who may know a lot about this topic? Can they be a reliable source of information? Is there any benefit, financial or otherwise, in terms of what is being shared? Is there any gain here? So that social media literacy, so you start to become a bit more of a critical thinker around the content that you're seeing online. O is for omit and reduce celebrity culture. So inspiration type of content, the inspiration content. We know that the hashtags have been banned, but there's ways around that. So there is still a lot of that content online, beauty content, and really anything that might lead to triggering urges to compare bodies with others, or, fall into that kind of comparison trap. T is for taking steps to alter the algorithm, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about the algorithm, and increasing diversity in terms of the content that you see. So this is about taking that step to add add people or content or pages that represent more than your stock standard beauty and appearance ideals and that content we've just mentioned. So increasing diversity of bodies and otherwise, and moving away from some of that appearance focused content, and taking some of the steps to alter the algorithm. So there are some things that you can do to shift a little bit the content that you're seeing and what's more likely to be shared that you'll come across. E is for engaging purposefully and authentically. So this is all about thinking of what are your values here and what's your intention when it comes to social media use. What's your purpose for using it, and thinking about how do you connect a little bit more with that. So rather than it being sometimes maybe a mindless activity where you might just scroll and look at things and not really be aware, it's considering how can you make that more intentional so that the things that you're seeing online are really aligned with what's important to you, what you're interested in, and maybe creating a sense of connection and community. C is for comparing less. So we're talking about all of the things around comparison and how do we start to reduce those comparisons and ask those questions around how helpful that is, and what, being aware of what you might be comparing yourself to. Often there's people post highlight reels or highlights, and when you're comparing yourself to this very tiny portion of someone's post or life, it's not you don't get the full picture, and that's not very helpful. And the last one, T, is for self-compassion. So applying those self-compassion principles. When we look at the literature, there's a lot of self-compassion that's coming through as a key factor to really mediating some of the impact that social media can have, particularly content such as Fitspiration. So it tends to reduce the negative impact that content will have on things like mood and body image. So certainly when you come across content that might be triggering, applying some self-compassion there. So those are the general key steps we talk about as an option to look at, rather than just stopping social media use altogether.
And just building on that, I think there is certainly a lot of research around the harms that social media can do, but also clinically we recognize there is actually some benefit to using social media in a different way. So certainly building community is incredibly important. So for people who have been marginalized for one reason or another, being able to connect with like-minded or people with lived experience of a similar nature can be incredibly powerful. One of the other things that we can do to improve body image particularly is to increase diversity. And that's a way that we can use social media to really actively immerse ourselves in a space that is broader and more reflective of what we really do see in the world, as opposed to what we would ordinarily get in this sort of microclimate of social media, which is often just a reflection of the thin, muscular, very, very narrow beauty standards. So we can really actively draw on some of the media that we're seeing to really help, I guess, create this microclimate of reflecting back to us the kind of diversity and the kind of bodies and the kind of, relationship with food and body that we would ideally like to uphold ourselves. So that can be something that can be actually very, very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it is really important for people to be able to curate their algorithm in a way that is very positive to them, I guess. And I definitely want to get to that. But I do want to go back to one thing that you mentioned, is very briefly talking about how, yes, eliminating social media use would definitely ameliorate body image, right? But we can even do that by reducing 50%, maybe even a little bit less than that for people for whom eliminating it is not an option. You don't want it to be an option, or it just doesn't really seem feasible to fit in with your life. Can you also talk about what other pieces of research say about social media and body image?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know certainly that there's particular content that's quite harmful and quite unhelpful. So, like Amanda was talking about before, the Fitspiration content. So that's the as you're probably pretty well aware, Fitspiration, short for fitness inspiration. The idea is that it shows quite muscular, athletic bodies generally doing some sort of physical activity. And the intention of that kind of content is to motivate people to exercise. But we know from a research perspective that's absolutely not the case. It makes people feel really terrible about themselves, so it reduces mood. It increases urges to exercise, but doesn't actually influence whether somebody engages in any physical activity at all. It also increases the likelihood that someone's going to self-objectify. And this is because most of the imagery in that space is very objectifying. So if you have a little look, for those of you where this feels safe, have a look at some Fitspo content. What you're going to see is very, very muscular bodies taken from angles that really just demonstrate the appearance of the body. It's not really about function at all. So there's certainly research that shows that kind of content is really unhelpful, that self-compassion is really helpful in buffering from some of those harms. We know also beauty content as well is likely to be very harmful, not only generally in terms of body image, but also in terms of preoccupation with the face and wanting to change the face. It also increases the likelihood that a person's going to engage in cosmetic procedures and cosmetic surgery. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what we're talking about here in terms of beauty content is absolutely astronomical. It's one of the biggest hashtags. Certainly it's one of the most searched hashtags. It's one of the most engaged with nature of content on particularly TikTok, but more broadly. And we know that it is very, very influential, particularly in the tween and early teen space. And it's having significant impact there in terms of body image as well. And so in terms of the beauty content, it absolutely is something that is going to change that preoccupation with the body, going to really move away from the experience of being within the body to being objectified and being able to see the body and seeing the body from the lens of the other. And it motivates people to want to change their bodies too, all of which is likely to increase what we call body surveillance. So the idea of monitoring and observing the body, and we know all of that is linked to body dissatisfaction. So there's lots of research around the nature of different types of content. We know there's also changes coming out, new things coming out now in terms of artificial intelligence. There's not a lot of research around this yet, but we know that certainly there's a lot of content out there now that is produced without humans involved whatsoever. There are modeling agencies that don't have any humans as a part of this agency in terms of the models. People can go on and completely change their appearances due to this artificial intelligence. So there's lots of this kind of content there on social media that is absolutely not being moderated in any way. And it's very difficult to determine what's being created this way and what's generally being created there too. So we know there's lots of that kind of harmful content we need to be cognizant of and be able to use a real critical lens in terms of trying to get a bit of a sense of who is creating this content, for what purpose, is this something that's helpful, how do I feel when I see this content, and how do I feel afterwards? Am I having any urges after viewing this kind of content? And that's often really telling, because if you're having urges to change yourself, then that's obviously not something that's promoting body satisfaction. So there's a big red flag for you. So there's lots of research there. And I wonder, Amanda, is there anything else to add there?
Yes, I was just going to say there's some particular research that looks at the content that is aligned with that appearance kind of cultural ideal of the thin ideal or the muscular ideal. That particular content, whether in video or photo form, tends to be the most harmful for body image. So when we look at that, it leads to higher levels of comparison. And then comparison's usually that kind of pathway through which the individual experiences a negative evaluation of themselves that leads to that body image dissatisfaction. So it's that content in particular, if it's something that's aligned with the thin or muscular ideal, you're more likely to walk away from that feeling pretty awful about yourself.
Especially when, it's so interesting because when we think about Fitspiration, the first thing I think of is like Pinterest in the early 2010s and stuff. And it's just like, it's completely back, but just in a different form. And when I think about those types of posts and pins and everything, it was all, well, first of all, like real bodies, quote unquote, not AI. And it was hard enough at the time. But then they were also paired with these very kind of shaming type messages of, oh, you should be able to do this. And, it's not even getting into like the pro Anna content and everything that was there as well. But it's like the team no days off. And like, if I can do it, you can do it too. And all this other stuff that could be viewed as, or is intended to be viewed as motivating, but it's inherently very shameful, and that already makes people feel so bad about themselves when they don't have the body. And for most people, there is no possible way of attaining the body that they're looking at unless it's completely plastic surgery or something like that. And I mean, I don't know of the studies on this, but it really seems like more and more people are getting like way and way more plastic surgery. And then like you mentioned with AI, when there's no way to tell if someone is real or if their picture is doctored or in any way, it's really just, it's terrifying. And it's kind of a way where you throw your hands up and it's almost like, oh, great. Now there's fake people on the internet in terms of AI. And like, how am I supposed to know what's real? How am I supposed to know what's not? How am I supposed to create this kind of safe container for myself on social media when sometimes I won't even know if someone has an AI generated image or not?
And even if it's not AI, this is best imagery. People are taking the best shot under the best lighting. They're using filters, and they're presenting themselves in a way that is unrealistic, even if it isn't AI, even if it is a human creating that content. And so that's a really difficult thing if you're coming in, and particularly if you're feeling vulnerable and you're coming into that space and seeing this, and the way that a lot of this material is presented, it's as though, look, I'm just hanging out in my bedroom and this is how I look, right? This is how I woke up. And that's just not the reality of the situation. And so this is so unfair, and people are naturally, humans are drawn to comparisons. And particularly if you already have body image dissatisfaction, you're going to be more likely to do that. And you're more likely to do it with what we call upward comparisons. So compared to people who have, the kinds of bodies that you idealize, or as a society is idealized. And so this is going to just keep this cycle going of exacerbating body dissatisfaction. It's really problematic. Luckily, in terms of the AI content at the minute, most people who are using AI currently are sort of almost bragging about it because it's new and novel. And so there is usually an AI hashtag at the bottom. But that's for now. I suspect that will change as things progress. And that's when we're referring to things like some of these businesses. But you can't tell if a person's using their own imagery. And this is a problem, I think, with Snapchat when we think about tweens and younger people using Snapchat. So many of these filters, some of them are really difficult to tell they're being used. And this is true for the AI filters as well. You can actually develop things like a LinkedIn profile picture using AI, and it'll filter you and it'll make your skin look glowing, and your eyes will even change shape to a degree, and so it'll really start to modify your face to look more in line with those white cisgendered, symmetrical, really, really narrow beauty standards. And so you may not be able to tell that a person is using those sort of filters in things like LinkedIn or other areas of social media there too. So it's really hard, particularly when we think about those comparisons. People are making comparisons to celebrities, to models, but they're also making comparisons to people that they know. And that can sometimes be some of the most problematic content, and certainly find that clinically in terms of comparisons there, and being able to tell whether this has been filtered or not.
One thing that's interesting that comes up in a lot of client sessions for me and Christina as well is when clients are engaging or maybe looking back on their own social media when they have experienced body changes and they see one person that doesn't match the person that they have in their inner monologue or their inner dialogue or whatever we want to call it. The way that they see themselves in their mind's eye doesn't match their physical appearance when they see themselves in a photo. And that can be very triggering as well. So if someone is experiencing that, which I guess we could call it a phenomenon, but it happens very often to people because bodies change. Spoiler alert, right? Our bodies are all going to change. If they have not already, they will at some point. And if someone out there is really struggling with that comparison of old picture of myself versus picture of myself now, what's some advice that you would give them?
Well, in terms of some of the ways that happens, quite commonly that happens on Snapchat and Facebook. And the reason that it happens on those two platforms particularly is because of the memories feature. So you may have experienced this if you're on Facebook yourself. You log on and it says, hey, have a look at these memories. 12 months ago today, this is what you were doing. And then 12 months, prior to that, this is what you were doing. And so it gives you this beautiful kind of, I guess, snapshot of your body over time. Snapchat does the same thing and actually also sends you a notification to say, oh, here you are 12 months ago, and so on. So those are features that you certainly can turn off, and that will really help on that front. And being able to be aware of the nature of the urge to do that and why there's a pull to do that and the harms done with those sort of comparisons, and really understanding that can be really valuable. Sometimes a person might find themselves often reflecting back on old photos in their phone, or perhaps they're, as you say, looking over old pictures on other platforms. If they can recognize that that's what they're doing, that they're getting into this spiral of comparisons, that this is actually evoking negative affect, this is actually increasing their urges to body surveil and to body check, and to, this is actually something that's kicking off this sequence of things that are really quite harmful in terms of body image. That can be really helpful there, to be aware and noticing and be able to hang on a minute, I'm going to do things differently this time around. I'm going to reduce the triggers. But when I am triggered and this is starting to kick off, I'm going to actually take myself out of this and do something that's quite soothing and compassionate here instead.
So then when we're talking about the algorithm, as we've referred to a couple of times, obviously, it's very easy to get pigeonholed into one place, and this is why there were originally lawsuits against TikTok, because people were getting stuck in the pro-anorexia space on there, and then it was like a rabbit hole that you could never dig yourself out of. But if we want to spin that and figure out, okay, let's say I want to continue using social media, and I would like to figure out a way that is going to be less negative for me to do that, less doom scrolling and stuff. What are some ways that you recommend people can help curate their algorithm in a more positive way?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the tricky thing is that each platform comes with its own set of algorithms and formulas and all sorts of things. And so some can be curated more than others. So when we think about platforms such as Instagram, it's a lot easier to curate what you see. So there, you can go into the settings and there's options to change particular content. So how much of, say, diet and food and wellness kind of content shows up in your feeds and on your explore page. You can certainly mute people. You can make suggestions about what kind of content you want to see and not see. The more you like and engage with content, the more that type of content will show up for you. So there's a lot more influence that you can have on Instagram in that way. And of course, depending on who you follow, then you're more likely to have that kind of content showing up, or more of that similar content. When we think about TikTok, for example, the algorithm is far more complicated and far more sophisticated. So even the people who created the algorithm don't necessarily, this has been kind of shared, that don't necessarily know exactly how it works. And the TikTok algorithm is a lot more difficult to influence. So really the key things that matter with TikTok are your behaviors when you're on the app. So what the algorithm will pick up on is whether or not you are watching the full video, whether or not you slow down, what's kind of happening with your facial features. Are is there any shock? Is there any reaction to what you are watching? Are you re-watching videos? All of those kind of things. And they will pick up on those nuanced responses and give you more of that content, essentially, and a lot more of it. So there's you're going to find it really hard to kind of come out of that. So there are ways to influence the algorithm on TikTok. So depending on who you follow, being really mindful of your behavior when you are engaging with that content, liking, selecting, searching for things that you want to see more of. And there's a couple of changes you can make to suggest that you don't want to see particular content. So you can select not to be shown that, and that will influence the algorithm over time. The difficult thing, again, with TikTok is that there will be particular feelers put out there. So this is the part that you don't have a lot of control over. So even when you're curating and you're selecting some things, you'll still get content that's put out there to essentially get a sense of whether or not you're interested. And again, if your reaction is one of shock and you watch it because of that, you're going to start to have more of that content showing up in your For You page. So just being mindful of that kind of your own responses and your behavior on TikTok. And I guess the other key thing to note is what matters is also your mood. There is some data to show that TikTok algorithm in particular has a way of predicting and noting what you might be feeling like, your preferences, your likes. So you can pick up on all of that pretty quickly.
I don't like that.
So yeah, it's really quite complex in that way. So if you go on TikTok when you're low in mood or you've been stressed or you're feeling vulnerable, that's going to impact the kind of content that you see and that's showing up for you. And you're more likely to find yourself spiraling or, scrolling and being in that space. So that's a really key factor too, of noting, how am I feeling right now? Is this a good time to be going on TikTok? There was some data that was shared at the conference last year that I mentioned, a study that was done by Melbourne University here in Melbourne by Dr. Scott Griffiths and his colleagues, looking at the data, the actual TikTok data, and they found that the algorithm could predict eating disorders by 90%. So that's more than any formula that has ever been designed could predict. So that's pretty intensive. But then the even more interesting data was looking at what happens once TikTok picks up that someone has an eating disorder. So if they're able to predict the type of content that is then shared specifically is quite shocking. So I'll share one of them. So if you have an eating disorder, the next video on TikTok that you're likely to receive is going to be 4,137% more likely to be pro-eating disorder toxic content. And you're more likely to receive food and diet related content. You're more likely to receive fitness related content and appearance related content too. So really staggering statistics there. So I guess with TikTok, it's its own separate, I think, entity in a way. So the way the algorithm works is a little bit different. So we need to be really considered about when you might be engaging and how you're feeling, and then being really mindful of your behavior when you're online. Some of the others, again, similar. You can make changes. Facebook is similar to Instagram in that you can select to see less of particular content. You can influence the type of advertisements that you see. So there's options in the settings to change that, so you're less likely to receive diet content or advertisement or body related. As Sarah mentioned, you can turn off memories if that's a bit of a trigger. And Snapchat is kind of similar in that way too. There are some settings that you can change to receive less of that content or to see less of that content.
And with Snapchat, one of the most important things is the 8 best friends. So who you engage with most on Snapchat, you'll end up with these close friends, the 8 best friends, and you'll see more and more of their content. So if you have somebody there posting Fitspo content, beauty content, or just some really idealized imagery, that's going to obviously be very harmful. And the other thing too with Snapchat is, of course, the filters. There are some filters that will make significant changes in terms of appearance. And so if you're immersing yourself in that space quite frequently and seeing yourself and your friends in that way, that's obviously going to distort your, your sense of how you appear and how others appear, and give you this kind of really unrealistic comparison point there. So that's also pretty useful to know. The other thing I was going to mention in terms of the algorithms is that we know there are inherent biases within them that are really important to be aware of, and this is true for all of the social media algorithms, but particularly true for TikTok. And we know that they do preference particular content from particular content producers. So if you are cisgendered, white, slim-bodied, with quite traditional beauty standards, your content is more likely to be seen by others than otherwise. If you're a part of a marginalized body, a marginalized group, you're less likely to be seen. There's a thing called shadow banning, which of course is around, which it's been talked about quite topically at the moment in relation to political content, but this happens also in relation to bodies as well. So what this means is that people, might share content, and it may be in relation to a physical disability, or it may be in relation to some sort of body attribute. And if you're from a marginalised body, this content may not be seen when other content that you've been producing previously has been. So just something to be very cognizant of in terms of how you use your social media. We have to be very aware that we need to be proactive in ensuring we're seeing diversity in terms of body size, in terms of bodies more broadly, and in terms of content, because it's not going to happen intuitively. It's not going to happen just on its own.
Yeah, and those statistics are staggering, right? Like over 4,000% more likely to be shown eating disorder content is absolutely crazy. One thing that I wanted to go into as well, when you were mentioning the Snapchat and the Snapchat, that just made me sound so old. Snapchat and the 8 best friends piece. I would love if we could talk a little bit more about how to work on boundaries with people who you know in real life, but you follow on social media, if they are posting content that is triggering for you.
Yeah, this is tricky because you don't want to be unfriending, your aunt. I mean, you can, but it might be a little bit controversial. So, we certainly can see less of this kind of content. So you can snooze people. You can actually see less of their content if you engage, especially with the meta platforms, that being Facebook and Instagram and the like. If you can not engage with that content, you're less likely to see it anyway. So that could be quite helpful. Look, it sometimes, depending on the nature of the relationship and how safe it is, you might be able to have a conversation with a person around boundaries in terms of, hey, I'm noticing that you're showing a lot of this content. I'm finding it really triggering. But I think that's quite challenging for a lot of people, and that can be a bit tricky. So it really just depends on the nature of the relationship and whether that's realistic or not. But certainly in terms of what you can do online, you can definitely make some shifts and changes. And I don't know if we've mentioned this, Amanda and I actually have some videos on our YouTube channel helping people go through some of the steps that you can engage in to be able to see less of content, to increase some helpful content and things like that, particularly in relation to TikTok and Instagram. So, but absolutely, that would be what would be recommended there. If you can have that conversation, really working with the algorithm to see less of that person's content. And if they're one of your 8 best friends, you certainly can shift that on Snapchat. You can make changes there too.
I still can't get over how I said the Snapchat.
I have a client that I said the Facebook. I said the Facebook to a client 4 years ago, and she's still picking on me about it.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
Sound like a dinosaur.
I'm never gonna live this down. So one last thing that I did want to touch on is you have this great concept and kind of question that you can ask yourself of, should I engage? And I would love to talk about that a little bit more when people are coming across content in the, if you are someone who is feeling down and you're consuming all this content, there is this question of should I engage with that or should I not engage with that, as opposed to just kind of consume it? So could you talk a little bit more about that?
And I think that's, really part of that first step of the acronym we talk about is that check-in, pause and check in. And that's, I think, often it's a really hard thing to do because you might, as we've mentioned, you might be mindlessly scrolling, or you might be taking a break, or whatever it might be. It might just be kind of routine or something that you're used to. And to take that pause can be difficult. So it takes a lot of awareness and kind of conscious effort to go, let me check in and see, how am I feeling? Am I feeling vulnerable? Am I feeling really stressed? Am I low in mood? Have I got lots going on for me at the moment? How's my body image today? Am I feeling vulnerable in that regard? And keeping that maybe front and center as you do doesn't mean that you don't then go on to the social media platforms. Maybe not TikTok, but, regardless, it's still that process of just keeping that front and center. So if you do go on, it's being mindful and aware that you might be more susceptible to finding certain content more difficult, more triggering. You might be more susceptible to comparing yourself, and then what impact that might have. And so it's that process of giving yourself the opportunity and a little bit of space to go, is that how I want to be responding, engaging? Is that what I want to be doing right now? Will that help me with how I'm feeling, or, the impact that might have? And it's also an opportunity to think about what's going to be most aligned with your values. If I do that right now, is that kind of aligned with what's important to me, how I want to present myself, or how I might want to be feeling? And so you won't always have this capacity to do that, but when you can, holding that awareness can be really helpful. And working out, again, in terms of that engagement, it's determining, how long do you spend online at that point in time? Do you comment? Do you like? Do you kind of keep scrolling? Are there particular parts of certain apps that you might be engaging with, but not others? Like if we think about Instagram, for example, maybe you engage with your feed. So it's people that you're following, that might be friends or colleagues or others, or whoever it might be, and so that might feel safe enough. But maybe you avoid the explore page because there could be content there that might be more difficult and triggering. So it's giving you an opportunity to really think about how you might want to engage and what's going to be most protective, most safe for you in that moment, depending on how you're feeling. So it's bringing forward that that reflection, that pause, that check-in with yourself, I think is really crucial. And I think that gives you more of a sense of having maybe some influence and control over what you're seeing, that it doesn't, feel like you're just in this rabbit hole of seeing lots of content and not having any power to influence that. So that opportunity to check in can be really helpful in that way.
Yeah. One of my personal favorite tools that I'm so glad that Instagram added, because I got rid of TikTok because quite frankly, was like, it is addicting. You're just on there and then you're like, where did 30 minutes go? Or more than that. But my favorite feature that Instagram has added, I don't know when, relatively recently, was the kind of Netflix, like, hey, are you still watching? But you can set the time limit on like, hey, you've been on here for a little while. Like, do you want to take a break? And I've set mine to a specific time. And every time it comes up, I'm like, you're right, I need to step away. It's time to take a break. So I would highly recommend for everyone who uses Instagram, definitely turn that feature on. And you can decide whatever limit is your time limit for the check-in of like, hey, nudge, nudge, you've been on here for a while. Could be 5 minutes, could be 30, could be an hour. Probably not the best to be on Instagram for an hour in a row, but still.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, those timer settings are really helpful. You can also, there's apps you can download to essentially make it impossible to go on. So you'll decide what your time frame and limit is, and then it kind of pauses the app, so you can't go into it until the next day or whatever the setting is. So that can be really useful too when you maybe think about that outside of the space of being online. So you might think about, okay, what's realistic, what's most helpful for me, and put in some of those time limits can be helpful. Just the reminders too. So as you say, you just kind of get that, oh yeah, I've been on for a while. Maybe it's time to take a break.
Well, it's so mindless. Sometimes you don't even realize and you're like, wait, what? What's going on?
Absolutely.
Where did that time go?
Absolutely. And a lot of people are using these platforms to self-regulate, to numb, to kind of move away the feeling distress. So turning to them to be able to kind of take a bit of a break from reality. And unfortunately, then you've got this scenario of the platforms, the goal of them is to keep you on there as long as possible and to give you information that's almost satisfying. So they're actually trying to create an itch without scratching it. So it's to keep you there as long as possible. So you've got this kind of vicious cycle. You're wanting to go there to feel better. And at the same time, you're kind of stuck there feeling worse as time goes on.
Yep. I'm getting even more dysregulated.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you both so much for the work that you do and for coming on today. This was a really great conversation, very practical with like a lot of tips. And I'll definitely send people to your YouTube channel and to the other free resources that you have on your website. But speaking of, please let people know all the places that they can find you.
Thank you. Absolutely, we will. We've also got a workshop, a social media and body image workshop that is accessible. You can find more information on our website, Eating Disorders Training Australia. and a workbook for people to work through to really try and improve body image whilst using social media. And we have various social media platforms that you can access as well. I'm sure you'll be able to find that on our website too.
Awesome. Thank you.
And thank you for having us, Dina. It's been lovely chatting with you today. And we love talking about this. So any opportunity to talk more about it is fantastic. But yes, thank you for your time and having us on.
Hey friends, it's Dana, and thanks so much for listening to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast today. Find us on social media at Wholehearted Eating Pod on Instagram and at wholeheartedeating.com for more information about working with Dana and Christina for one-on-one nutrition counseling. If you love the show, we would love you forever if you'd share an episode with your family and friends, or tag us on social media, or leave a 5-star rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts to help more people find the show. Check out patreon.com/wholeheartedeating to help support the show and get access to ad-free episodes, bonus episodes with us and our guests, episode discussions, new resources we're creating for Patreon, and so much more. If you have questions for us, feedback on the show, potential topics or guests you'd love to have on, shoot us an email at hello@wholeheartedeating.com, and we'll see you next week.